Hello, I would like to thank you very much for the invitation to speak here today and apologize for any blips and ums and ahs during my recording. I got given a brief for this talk to talk about collections in teaching and research and also extend this to collections as cultural heritage, something in which I'm very comfortable with talking and look forward to discussing. Okay. Hello, thank you very much for the invitation to address this event. I only wish I were there in person. I will also apologize in advance for any blips during my recording. I got given a brief to talk about collections in teaching and research and extend this to collections as factors in our cultural heritage discussions. I'm very grateful for the title that Petra gave to the talk on collections and archives as spaces of ideas and knowledge. I'm pretty sure we can see the meaning of this in our post-COVID or gradually post-COVID world, where spaces are not just mental environments, places where we come together through texts, exchanges, but also literal spaces where things happen, especially with relation to research. I cannot escape discussing the concept of space, the fact that I am based in Reading, at a university where a small department in a pretty creaky old building is surrounded with the materials of our research. This is a small space, quite different from what people expect to see in a traditional university environment. At its best, it functions like a startup in a large institution. At its worst, it's a small sibling that doesn't know whether it's ignored or being bullied. But at the heart of the department, our way of working is access to material resources. There's a belief that we need to see things, and not just on screen, but actually firsthand. We need to hold things in our hands. We need to understand how they are made. We need to understand the ergonomics of interacting with them. We need to see if they have seriality, a narrative, a kind of engagement with them that is not necessarily presented very well in a digital environment. And I hold here, in this case, an intentionally interactive object that plays with the conventions of layering and hypertext, but in print form. I think an entirely impossible object to represent digitally. In my mind, the archives are important because they allow us to have structured inquiries. They allow us to have very open discussions with our context and our field, but actually give us channels for discovery. They also allow us to moderate the impact of digital ways of working. And I say this quite consciously because we are increasingly having people whose entire educational experience has been through flat screens, which normalize formats and representations. They flatten materiality into something that is not easy to interpret. And yet that matters. If I show someone this little book, which is an informal, cheap edition from the 1570s, has to be seen as something different from this, from the same publisher, but printed for a king, just 2 years apart. Just the scale, the heft, the way things are bound, the quality of the paper, which type is being used, how it is typeset. These are things that are very difficult to represent digitally, but are quite important in order for people to understand the different meanings that are assigned to objects. And look at them together matters a lot. So we're in an environment where craft practice and materiality matter. Even if we are making digital resources, these things matter because we interact with objects. More importantly, practice, and that's where collections come in, operate as network effects. They are at the center of many different fields of practice, many different ideas, and they embody these different perspectives. That is something that goes somewhat against the trend in research, where we are being pushed to be ever more specialized and go down narrow rabbit holes. It's a quite anachronistic way of thinking of research as the nexus of a true interdisciplinarity in the sense of a hungry polymathy for knowledge and curiosity, where the goal is a sufficient understanding of unrelated on the surface fields in order to understand how they relate to practice. This helps us be much more open in how we interpret things and not where lenses that only come from one specific discipline. It helps us be much more critical towards our sources and how they're interpreted. And it helps us be open and empathetic towards the resources, expecting that they will continue to change in their interpretation for us. That relates to something that is very current in recent discourse, and it is thankful that we now have EDI as a term or a collection of terms that we can use in our discourse, but it's something that is central to working with archives for quite a long time. This matters because a lot of our scholarship is mostly Anglo-centric, or we can say Northern European-centric, and it has very specific ideas about scholarship. It is something that looks like a book. It's a big book. It's hundreds of pages. It reads in a specific way. It is distributed in a specific way, and it has identifiers of currency or respect that matter to it. And yet the materials we might be looking at might be things like the commercial objects of people just making stuff or trying to distribute things without thinking that they're object of research. That matters quite a lot. It also has to do with new ways of thinking about what research might be. Is it something that is visually very rich? Is it something that, for example, looks at spaces within which marketing happens as well as the objects in which they're presented? Or is it something that reveals completely new ways of looking at things using techniques of rethinking how we approach existing objects? All of this stuff is open, and it helps us open up our ways of thinking in a way that is much more decentralized in the wider sense. It also opens ways of thinking that question precepts of previous scholarship. So a return to the primary sources allows to question things like established and revered objects, in case Fleron and Stanley Morrison, but also allows us to think much more carefully about how people discuss objects. There's a lot of interesting evidence in this, and has a lot to do with new publication sources. So returning to primary sources allow us to ask questions, and there's a lot of work happening right now where we can see people doing research, rediscovering work and making it available. It might be in conventional publications, or it might be in ways that are even inaccessible to us. But we can see that there is quite a lot of work that is happening by a lot of researchers. It's just not circulated in the conventional channels that we think are relevant for us. That is quite important because it questions how conventional educational programs are structured. They tend to be by definition exclusionary if you consider that now your resources need to be digitally available on a centrally managed library system where people can just click and get something that exists within the gated environments of academic publishing. Indeed, getting materials like I've just shown to be available to students is seriously problematic because these things don't have ISBNs or DOIs. This environment allows us to think very much about local histories and how we are enabling histories that have not been expressed yet. So not just rethinking existing narratives, but actually enabling new narratives. That matters a lot because we don't really seek to replace existing books with new kind of books, but open up a new kind of scholarship that is based on the original materials, enables people to think in different ways about the connections and the meaning of these objects. So we want to open up agnostic routes of discovery and question the formats in which research happens and outputs. That inevitably will lead to uncomfortable perspectives, but that is important, especially as we're working in environments that really were excluded quite significantly from the canonical histories of typography. That matters very much for people in the audience. We are working in small environments that were not very much recognized in canonical histories, and also are at the center of extremely layered and complex cultural narratives. So that is something that this approach can help us have something that's a more constructive discussion. The methodology for this is fairly simple. It starts with looking things at multiple scales. Ideally, scales that connect the objects to the context. And this is something that is very much lacking from a lot of design histories which focus on the object itself rather than how this object is something that connects to wider concerns. Then the scale that the object is interacted with, and lastly, the scale that reveals its making. So the context scale is something that has to do much more with social history, economic history, financial history, understanding the demographics, understanding authoring environments and workflows of making and distributing things, and even understanding political frameworks and ideas of authorship and inquiry. So what a state chooses to promote in its educational policy will have an impact on what research is being produced. The level of interaction, I showed some examples earlier where the materiality, the ergonomics of working with things, the cost of getting materials in order to make stuff, all influences what is being made, how our ideas of information hierarchies change and how things are made available to us, how easily, how exclusionary or inclusionary are these. The whole discussion of accessibility with typography falls at this scale. Lastly, the area which we see most of the writing being about, which is the understanding of the technology of making things, how things are being produced in specific technologies, be it a mold with punches or a Unicode encoding for a font. That brings a lot the problem of describing objects. So the terminology that we use, whether it comes from a specific language, specific environment, technical environment or not, and whether any other language has the potential to develop its own native terminology for things, that comes very much into play in enabling this kind of research. So it is important to be able to allow people to see objects, the same objects through different perspectives. I can see the text that might be the same kind of text produced at different times in its publishing history with different modes of reception. I can see a text that is simply a text or a text with annotated additions and notes, in which case the text has become another meta text in itself. We can see how typefaces that are made to produce text connect to ideas of what is a highbrow or lowbrow at the time, or new, novel or traditional in an environment. And then we can finally dig in to typefaces and see how they reflect specific networks of trade and commerce in the area. Using sets of objects, multiple objects, is absolutely critical in this respect. That is something that again goes against the trend in how archives work, where people want to make individual objects accessible in a screen-based interface. It's the way that traditional research might work, in the sense that you might go and get a lot of things and put them on a table, whereas now you're looking at individual index records that you have to know what to search for in a field and then get individual sets of images on screen. The wonderful work that's been done digitizing classical works of typography in institutional libraries is a very good example of this, where it is actually very difficult to see multiple objects side by side unless you fake it by opening multiple browser windows and try to flip very quickly through them, an impossibility in combinatorial research. But having a lot of things in front of us forces us to start asking questions. How do I start looking at things that are too big to take in with a single glance? What criteria am I going to use in this? What questions am I asking? Am I referring back to my structure of 3 levels of 3 scales to look at things? Can I draw descriptors from there to then start asking questions? That's very helpful, because then I can then also exclude things that I'm looking when I'm looking at sets of things, and I can ask about materials or formats or interaction, ignoring, for example, the typefaces or the materiality, and then drop down to that level. So this selective way of looking at things in a structured way helps people reinforce the way they look at an open and potentially unpredictable set of objects. It builds qualitative analysis skills. And it also helps us explain things to people from very different perspectives. So in this example, where we're looking at early digital publications from the middle of the 80s onwards with postgrad students, the same objects mean very different things to people depending on their age and whether they were in a society that participated visually, in terms of visual culture, in these first waves of digital innovation. Whereas for others, it is not different from something that is 200 years old, historical event, for which they are reading only after it happened. It was not something that influenced their the visual communication of their culture. So this is a very interesting set of questioning when we're looking not only at the objects, as I said, but also the act of looking at the objects and ask how this can lead us to different interpretations. At the heart of all of this is the effort to build thematic descriptions. I think this is the key to interpreting archival collections with insight and to be able to do some justice to the complexity of the objects. It also allows us to get some sense of whether something is truly unique. Is it part of a trend, or is it, and we haven't looked at enough things to understand that's part of a trend, or is it within the trend, but is it an outlier within it? So the position of something in the set of things that people are doing in that sphere at the time allows us to understand whether these things are examples of innovation in some way, or are examples of reinforcement of a trend, or confirmation that a certain practice is moving a specific way. I use these kind of terms in terms of concentric circles around an object to have this kind of discussions with students. Thinking about material, financial, emotional, social, cultural, and historical aspects to them. And they are not mine. They come from this wonderful little book on jewelry, about which I know next to nothing. But the authors, Marianne Unger and Suzanne van Leeuwen, have written a wonderful set of essays explaining how to approach a set of objects that are extremely diverse, both in their place in society, their function, their roles, and how to interpret them. And they are very good starting points for looking at objects. Myself, in looking at objects that are more typographic, tend always to look at these kind of themes, whether things are playing an active role in the tension between modernity and traditionalism in a society, which would then allow me to ask questions about where is this society, what is this society, how does it define itself, and how does it discuss these issues within itself. It helps me ask about originality and innovation, and how is this defined in very different conventions. Again, in our fields now, the idea that we are working in some areas where there are significant archives that allow us to have an established body of work that is a canon against which innovation might happen is a very different conversation, looking at areas where the archives not only exist in place as ephemeral objects that are captured and perhaps not necessarily preserved in their entirety, or are things that are in place literally when we're looking at the infrastructure in cities, lettering on buildings, and so on. The other discussion to look at is that between authorship, ownership, and so on. Who has agency in making decisions about how we interpret things and how they are referred to? Are they institutional? Are they personal? Are there issues that have to do with, again, diversity and inclusion relating to this kind of attribution? And finally, the issue of terminology and specification is absolutely central. What terms are we using to describe things? That happens extremely visibly whenever we try to have a conversation outside the main Anglophone literature, where a lot of terminology is very actively developed, but immediately when we try to have translations to terms, we see that there is often an uncomfortable relationship with historical terms or traditional terms that might not adapt very quickly. That is, I think, a key part in fostering a discussion that is based on archives, because then these also allow us to ask questions about what the trades, the craftspersons that made the original objects in their original location used to describe what they were doing. That all leads me to think of our practice as belonging in a field that I could describe as applied humanities rather than art and design, because we do need to bring these techniques of looking at objects, interrogating objects, and asking questions very much from the broader humanities sector into how we interpret archives. That is at the heart of developing narratives of belonging, narratives of meaning. This has a lot to do with the human condition. In many ways, our objects are what populates our institutional, our cultural, our social, our emotional memories and ideas that we have about ourselves, our communities, and how we relate to others. In Europe, we are very much aware of these kind of concerns these days. And again, I will return to the Balkans, which are a melting pot of these concerns and an extremely good location in which to place these kinds of concerns. Throughout this conversation, I am worried that I am stating the obvious. I don't think there's anything profound in what we are discussing here, but it is a challenge to make these points to institutions and structures which are driven very much by fairly narrow ideas of what research and design might be, making very strong connection to commercialization and the longitudinal value of degrees in research. So I'd be looking very much to extend this conversation going forward. Thank you very much.